Arrests across Canada. Tonight on Nation to Nation. Trudeau called for the blockades to end, police responded, and it only got worse.
We know that this would only escalate the situation. That's exactly what we're seeing right now. And I think it shows a real failure of the current Prime Minister.
Liberals think Trudeau has shown courage in withstanding attacks from the opposition.
And frankly, I think our Prime Minister has been, shown a great deal of leadership, great deal of resolve.
The feds don't want to pay the family of children that died in care, at least not at the Human Rights Tribunal.
I just think of youth like Tina Fontaine, who died waiting. Jolyn Winter from Wakapika, whose life was lost to suicide.
Hello, I'm Todd Lamran, and welcome to Nation. What a difference a week could make, or for Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, just a couple of days. The Prime Minister initially said Canadians needed to be patient with Wet'suwet'en solidarity demonstrations. But then he said people were losing their patience and that the blockades needed to come down. If that sounds familiar, it's because Conservative leader Andrew Scheer said much of the same thing initially. He has also called protesters a small group of radical activists. Trudeau accused Scheer of putting Wet'suwet'en hereditary chiefs into that same group in question period yesterday. So here we are with multiple blockades and multiple arrests across Canada. And to discuss all this is our political panel of MPs. Welcome to Nation.
Thank you for having us.
Now, I'll treat this like question period. I'm going to go to the official opposition first. Mr. Schmel, it seems like Trudeau is finally getting tough, like the Conservatives wanted, asking for blockades to come down. So, but that just made things worse. So why do this?
Well, first of all, we have called for the Prime Minister to take action for weeks now. So we've got to the situation now because of inaction by this Prime Minister. You'll remember when it was just starting to bubble, we were calling for the Prime Minister to come back from Africa from his tour for this useless UN Security Council seat. He refused to do so. It was only when the blockade started to really close down certain parts of the economy that he canceled his trip to the Caribbean for that same cause. So this situation did not have to come to where we are now, and we have people, and to your opening comment, what Andrew Scheer was talking about was there were the Wet'suwet'en people and the bands within the community, and we encourage that traditional method of conflict resolution. We hope that continues. We also want talks between the provincial government, the federal government, and the band leaders to continue. We think that's important. That's the way out, is with dialogue. But what Andrew Scheer was focusing on was the group of anti-energy activists who have glommed on to this situation and have claimed it as their own. Many, not all, have no connection to the Wet'suwet'en whatsoever, and their main goal is to shut down energy development within Canada.
But if the Prime Minister had gone in there with a heavy hand weeks ago, like Mr. Scheer suggested, wouldn't this just have happened weeks ago instead of now?
Well, we didn't suggest a heavy hand all at once. The dialogue part was always something we were advocating for. It was when parts of the economy started to shut down, that's when we called for the rule of law to be upheld. And now, as you'll see the other day, we have people who are trying to derail or block trains, putting the safety of many at risk, and that is unfortunately unacceptable because you cannot try to derail a train. That takes it to the next level. The rule of law has to be upheld. And don't forget of the Wet'suwet'en people and the communities that supported the Coastal GasLink project. These are jobs, opportunity that are waiting for these people. And we need to move forward with this project. It's gone through the process, 5+ years of consultations. The company did everything right. It got approval, and we need to move forward with this project.
Ms. Gazan, what do you think the Prime Minister should have been doing?
Well, I mean, our party's been very clear all along. I mean, the hereditary chiefs asked for a meeting with the Prime Minister. We've been very clear that the RCMP needs to stand down. We've recommended appointing a mediator to help dialogue, progress. I think, first of all, Trudeau was missing in action, and then, he's calling in the RCMP. We know from Ganazadage, we know from Ipperwash, we know that this would only escalate the situation. That's exactly what we're seeing right now. And I think it shows a real failure of the current Prime Minister to actually lead resolution. And for a Prime Minister who was so committed to nation, I think he's failing at that miserably.
Mr. Anand Sangari, people are now accusing the Prime Minister of flip-flopping. He preached patience, and then late last week it was now these are blockades are illegal and the rule of law must prevail. But haven't First Nations been patient for 150 years? I mean, how much more patient do they have to be?
Todd, look, the situation that we're facing right now is very complex and very charged, both emotionally as well as the effects towards Indigenous Canadians and all Canadians. We're right now resolved to continue to engage in discussion. Our minister right now is in British Columbia as we speak, and she's hoping to meet along with the BC counterpart, meet with the chiefs, hereditary chiefs in Smithers, and we hope that we will come to a proper conclusion to the situation. But what's important is we still have a longer-term view of what we need to do. Yes, we recognize that there are going to be short-term challenges in what we call reconciliation, the journey towards reconciliation. And these challenges are these moments in how national leaders react, how the Prime Minister reacts, and frankly, I think our Prime Minister has been, shown a great deal of leadership, great deal of resolve, but also a great deal of courage in withstanding the level of attacks that he's had from the opposition. We've always been focused on having a dialogue and to have conclusion based on dialogue and mutual respect. But the longer-term work for us is really ensuring self-government agreements are in place, ensuring we get to a place where we have true self-determination that enables Indigenous communities to be able to determine their future. And with the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples as its backdrop, which, again, we're committed to bring forward as legislation this year.
But in the midst of this crisis, I guess, why didn't you do what the Bloc actually suggested on Tuesday in question period? The Prime Minister and his ministers get on a plane to British Columbia and resolve it quickly, while at the same time suspending police operations.
Well, in terms of our government, our ministers, both Minister Miller as well as Minister Bennett, have been fully engaged on this from the beginning. The Prime Minister has overseen his team of ministers, and he's gathered them a number of times, and he's shown the resolve of our government to move forward in a proper and respectful way. And Minister Bennett's been absolutely available to meet. She was in Victoria last week. She's now back in the West Coast right now. Minister Miller met in Belleville last week, and we've had ongoing engagements and discussions. And I think what's important is that look, it's easy to do what people are suggesting that we do, especially the Conservatives. But the long-term effects of tarnishing that relationship, I think, could potentially be irreparable. And what we need to do is focus on, yes, the short term, but also ensure that we don't derail the long-term goals of reconciliation.
Mr. Schmel, I'm just going to pick up on a point that Mr. Ananda Sangari said, and that's if we do it the way the Conservatives do, we will tarnish the relationship. What do you say to that?
Well, reconciliation includes economic reconciliation. We have an opportunity to provide jobs, opportunity, and wealth for a number of First Nations communities along the pipeline and around it. This is a path forward. People have the right to protest, legally protest, absolutely, say your piece however you want. The problem is you have thousands of Canadians now without jobs. You have millions, tens of millions of dollars in economic value halted. You have grain farmers now saying they got about a week left before some of their product starts to rot. You have potential fuel shortages out in the East Coast. You cannot shut down the Canadian economy. This is paramount. Okay, the courts have said the protests are illegal. Now, as I said before, I do agree with my friends. Talks need to continue. That is first and foremost. We're going to get through this discussion. But we got to this point because of, as my NDP friend said, the lack of action, the lack of attention, the lack of leadership by this Prime Minister. He ignored it, thought if he buried his head in the sand long enough, it would just go away. And now it has escalated to the point where we have people trying to derail trains in this country.
Ms. Gazan, I'd like you to respond to what you've heard so far.
Well, I mean, you know, with all due respect, I know the Liberal Party is talking, the Prime Minister is about it being a complex situation. I think the message is really clear. Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples throughout the country want to see fundamental human rights for Indigenous peoples. This last government, you know, they stalled the Bill C-262 to fully adopt the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. They are stalling it again. You know, till the fall. It's very clear. The Liberal Party and consecutive Liberal and Conservative parties have failed to deal with long-standing land matters in this country. And, you know, going back to your point, Todd, they have been patient, particularly Ganazatawge, who's been waiting at the table for over 300 years. Young people across this country, I know that, you know, people are calling them, you know, violent activists, but they're actually, you know, many young people across this country who are worried about the climate emergency. They are asking people in leadership in this current government that will not meet climate targets to take the climate emergency seriously. And I think it's time that we stop the rhetoric. Our party has offered a very clear path forward. And I hope they take it. I just, for example, introduced a private member's bill, Bill 232, the Climate Emergency Action Act, that looks at how to address the climate emergency in respect of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. There are paths forward, and it's time that this government and Trudeau stop stalling and actually act.
If I may just set the record. So Bill 262 was brought forward by our NDP colleague Romeo Sagnash in the last Parliament. Our party worked very hard to support it. We supported it committee. We supported it at every stage, and we passed it in Parliament. You know, with the support of other parties as well. The Conservative Party blocked it, and going further in the Senate, it was blocked from a procedural manner by the Conservative Party. We're absolutely committed to implementing UNDRIP with 262 as what we call the floor and not the ceiling.
But even if you had UNDRIP, I don't know if that would have solved this crisis that we're in.
And Todd, this is exactly what I'm saying, right? And yes, we will have challenges in this path, right? This is not, you know, there's no silver bullet. We will have glitches and challenges along the way. And the ultimate test is how we address those challenges. How do leaders address these challenges at these moments? Do we have knee-jerk reactions? Do we react, you know, in a way that perhaps satisfies our base, but will have longer-term damage to the actual relationship? And I think that's where our Prime Minister has been focused on, and frankly, I think he's done a really good job in ensuring that we balance the need for people to express themselves, ensuring that the Wet'suwet'en people are able to basically have their points brought forward in a respectful manner, and to also ensure that our economic interests are secured.
Okay, well, we could obviously keep going on about this topic, but we're out of time. I want to thank you again during a really bad snowstorm here in Ottawa for making it today. Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
Coming up, the deadline to figure out how to compensate children and families caught up in the child welfare system has come and gone. Cindy Blackstock will give us the latest. Welcome back. With all the protests and blockades, some may have forgotten there's another fight going on here in Ottawa. Cindy Blackstock's struggle for First Nations children hasn't stopped. She's working to completely overhaul the on-reserve child welfare system. And by doing so, she successfully won a Canadian human rights complaint that Canada willfully and recklessly discriminated against First Nations children in care. Right now, Blackstock, along with the Assembly of First Nations and Canada, are trying to come to terms on compensation, $40,000 per child and affected family members. Ms. Blackstock now joins me in studio. Welcome to Nation to Nation.
Thanks for having me.
Now, just remind our viewers about the Human Rights Tribunal's compensation order and what's going on right now.
Sure. Well, a lot of your viewers know that in 2007, 13 years ago, we filed a case against Canada because it was providing unequal child welfare funding, which was driving children into care. And then the second part is they weren't implementing Jordan's Principle, so a lot of kids were going without services. In 2016, the tribunal ruled that the complaint was substantiated. But under the Act, it actually allows for victims of the discrimination to receive compensation. The tribunal took that under reserve, and it wasn't until September 2019 that they released their decision. And a couple really important things came out of that decision. Number one, they find that Canada was willfully and recklessly discriminating, which means it was on purpose, and they could have prevented it. Second thing is that the discrimination is still ongoing. So it really troubles me when I hear government representatives like Minister Miller saying the discrimination is in the past when it's clearly still going on, and that should be a top priority for Canada to stop it. And the tribunal said, you got to come up with a process to distribute the compensation, and that's what our filings were on Friday, were about the process.
As you just mentioned, it's been 13 years of this journey, and it's been impossible to get Canada to the negotiating table. So what changed lately to actually have that happen?
Well, it's interesting, in this broader discussion of the Wet'suwet'en case, and I see the Canadian government talking about rule of law. Well, in our case, we've had 9 non-compliance orders against the Canadian government trying to get them to stop this discrimination against children. As you say, they were ordered to start these discussions on process with us in September 2019. They didn't appoint anyone, so we just continued to work on our own, the Assembly of First Nations and ourselves. Then they finally did in December, but really progress was slow. And they still don't have direction on key things.
Let's not forget, there was a deadline for December,
exactly.
the end of December.
And we filed a big affidavit about everything we had done by then, but Canada said they needed an extension, and then another extension, saying that they were going to get direction from Cabinet on these issues, but that direction still hasn't come, so it's clearly not a top priority for Canada.
So I guess what's happening then if they still don't have direction, and the deadline is passed?
The deadline is passed, and so what that means is we have uncertainty about a whole pile of issues. You probably read in our submissions, one of the things the Caring Society and AFN believe very strongly is that children who have passed away as a result of Canada's discrimination, or during the time of the discrimination, and their parents and loved ones, they ought to receive that compensation. Canada's not made a commitment to that, and that is a big question. The other is that Canada is continuing to move forward with its federal court piece to try and quash all the compensation. So while it's working on the process and there has been some progress, Canada is continuing its efforts to quash all financial compensation. So we can't even agree from Canada that they agree with the $40,000 being the floor of compensation and not the ceiling.
As you just mentioned, Canada said that the families of deceased children were not capable of experiencing discrimination. Does anything surprise you anymore with the federal government on these issues?
It breaks my heart. I just think of youth like Tina Fontaine, who died waiting. Jolynn Winter from Wakapika, whose life was lost to suicide when she ought to have received services for mental health under Jordan's Principle. And of course, Marina Beadle, who just passed away this past fall, the courageous mother from the Mi'kmaq Nation, who brought the first case on Jordan's Principle to get help for her son and won that case, the first legal precedent. And then she becomes a person who would be eligible for compensation, but then she dies while she still sees this ongoing fight for justice. Those are the people just some of the people who have had these tragic outcomes. And I just think it's reprehensible that Canada would even consider for a minute that it could save money by not paying out the compensation to the people who its discriminatory policies contributed to the derision of their lives and in some cases the loss of their lives.
I suppose what are some areas other than what we've mentioned already where you and Canada still aren't on the same page?
Well, there's a few areas. A couple of decisions we're waiting for. One is capital. As you know, they said they'll pay for prevention services at actual cost for agencies, but they won't provide buildings to provide those prevention services in communities where there's huge housing crises in many cases. That's a big issue that's still under reserve. The other piece that we need to get some more clarity on is we take the position that the Canadian Human Rights Act can only go back to January 1st, 2006 with its awards. That's the way the Act is structured. We want children who are removed before then, but were actually in care of that as of that date, to also receive compensation. Canada has not given us a position on that. We put in our submissions to the tribunal that we feel that those children were subject to the same discrimination, so we're the caregivers and they ought to receive compensation. So there's a lot of, Canada's not put on the table the key pieces of what would be required to comply with the tribunal's order, and that's concerning.
Of course, part of their argument is about the 2 pending class action lawsuits that are going on right now related to unreserved child welfare. I suppose, does there still need to be those 2, and should we even Canada be thinking about that when it's dealing with you?
No. We've made it clear from the beginning. The Canadian Human Rights Act provides damages to victims that is separate from a class action. These victims are free to pursue other remedies under a class action. But Canada should not be saying, oh, well, we only want to deal with one group, so we don't want to pay these penalties under the Canadian Human Rights Act and somehow strike a better deal under a class action. It ought to be they've got to meet their obligations under the Canadian Human Rights Act. And let's face it, Todd, we know, both of us, they are a repeat offender with our kids. They ought to pay a bigger penalty this time. They did all the horrors to the children in residential schools, then repeated that same behavior with the 60 scoop. Now 9 compliance orders and counting. Clearly this generation warrants a higher penalty to try and get Canada to stop its behavior. And then it'll see what else it can do with the class action. And I really want to just give my support to all of the youth in care and, of course, the late Marina Beadle who brought those class actions, because that takes a lot of courage to do that.
Ms. Blackstock, as always, it's a pleasure to speak to you. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
We'll have more after another short break. Welcome back. Again, other things have been happening in Ottawa this week. Correctional investigator Ivan Zinger appeared before the House's Public Safety Committee. Once again raised an alarm how the overrepresentation of Indigenous people in federal prisons continues to grow.
I would say it's beyond a crisis right now, and we have to look at not just tweaks, but bold initiatives to address this.
His number one solution comes from the TRC's calls to action.
Allow, again, the Minister of Public Safety to enter into agreements with Indigenous communities and groups for the care, custody, or supervision of Indigenous people. That, in my view, would be the greatest contribution to the call for action for corrections. So their contribution should be a huge shift of resources.
Conservative MP Mark Dalton brought up an issue reported in Montreal's French language newspaper, La Presse.
There's situations happening where they could, inmates could just declare themselves as Métis and receive a lot, significantly improve some benefits. So without necessarily any proof of attachment to the Métis community. I speak as a Métis person myself.
Zinger called the article as one not based on facts.
If you are Indigenous in our system, in federal corrections, you're more likely to be released later in your sentence. You're more likely to be subject of use of force. You're more likely to be self-harming. You're more likely to have your parole suspended or revoked. There's no real benefit in declaring yourself Indigenous.
That's all the time we have this week. If you missed any part of tonight's show or a previous episode, you can check out our podcasts. Go to aptnnews.ca/podcast. I'm Todd Lamoran. Thanks for watching.